It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Professor Hillel Levine, a professor of sociology and Jewish history at both Harvard and Yale University. Hillel, you wrote the seminal and I think the groundbreaking work In Search of Sugihra. You wrote it back in '96 when Sugihra wasn't so well known, and your book, in my opinion, and I think anyone who's read the book, is the gold standard. That is the most researched and informative, and it really was groundbreaking. And it is such an honor and a privilege to have you here in Jerusalem, in Beit Vegan. And if you could tell our listeners how you came about the story of Sugihra and what led you to write this masterpiece called In Search of Sugihra.
Thank you, Dr. Les. I am honored to be with you and to have this discussion. You are a new friend. I thought you were a massive nudnik. You pursued me and the truth in the story of Sugihra with such passion, with such unbelievable passion. I said to myself, who is this man? He's a dentist, he has a family, he has all kinds of things. He doesn't have anything better to try to find me and to try to hear my side of the story. Dr. Les, you are an unbelievable man, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
The pleasure is mine, and you're very kind.
Ad 120 shana. I would say that as a historian, my motto is B'chol drachecha da'ehu, that I try to understand the different pathways to truth, the different pathways to goodness, and I've had the privilege of going places and learning about cultures that I never thought that I would know anything. I was invited to China for 6 months, and it was an extraordinary experience. I was supposed to be teaching about America. I ended up teaching about Israel, of course, and it contributed to the diplomatic relations that developed soon thereafter. Simply having a Jew there and being willing to talk and to share, very, very profound. Soon thereafter, I got interested in Japanese, and I was invited to teach in Japan, and particularly to a sort of network of churches, all called House of Anna, all what the Japanese knew about the Holocaust was Anna Frank, and they had their churches named for Anna Frank. And I taught at the university, and I also taught at these churches. I soon found out that their involvement with Jewish faith was far deeper. The head of this was a Christian who, in the 1930s, had a vision that the Jews would soon be going back to their homeland, and there would be a state of Israel. In 1938, he predicted this. He then lived out the war, living near Hiroshima and terrible places, and escaped from that, and gathered some Japanese around him and opened up all of these churches. I talk about this man because he was the man who introduced me to Sugihra. Introduce is hardly the word. Like like Dr. Les, like any Mishugala Davar, a man of passion, he just did not let go of me. He said, you have to learn about the story of this great rescuer. No one really understands it. And I said to him, what do you expect of me? I don't know a word of Japanese. How am I ever going to understand anything about Sugihara? He said, don't worry about that. You just begin to speak to people who knew him and who knew the results of his activity, and you will get to the truth. Well, I went back home and I said, all right, I'm going to try to learn something about Sugihara, but where do I start with this? Who has the documents? Who has the records? And I realized that I had to go back to Japan and say that I'm just because I'm a historian doesn't mean that I can pick up the trail of something like this. And I said, I don't know a word of Japanese, and there's a lot to read because diplomats write letters and to other diplomats and documents, and I want to get to the core of it. He said, don't worry, you go to Tokyo and you go to the university where you're teaching, and we will come and we will help out. Well, help is hardly the word. It turned out that I had taught at the universities, and the most brilliant Japanese students, and some of them were attached to Bet Shalom, what they called it. And as soon as I got back to Tokyo, I was told, tomorrow morning we will pick you up with a car and we will go to the archives. The archives, where documents are stored, not Bubba-Mices, but documents and the records of people's. So the next morning, a car comes, picks me up, takes me to the archives, and I noticed that the former student of mine, who I liked very much and was very, very bright, he was holding something under his shoulder when we went into the archives, and it turned out to be a bottle of sake. He knew that once I get involved in this thing, there's going to be a lot of tumult, a lot of behavior that isn't really appropriate for the archives, like staying there for a couple of months to check all the documents. So they had to grab the goodwill of Japanese bureaucrats who knew nothing about Sugihara, didn't care about Sugihara, but make sure that I had access to the derech. It was a derech that I had to find and a derech that I had to open, and many wonderful people helped me. So how do you read these documents? How do you find these documents? There was no folder on Sugihara. No one cared enough to make a folder on Sugihara. Well, it turned out that there were a lot of wives of diplomats who had spent years in America or England, and they knew English very, very well, and they started coming around and volunteering, and they'd come very, very nervous, shaking their heads, and say, "Professor, we never went to university. We don't know very much about history. We only know Japanese." I said, "We'll get it all straight. Come and be with us and help us understand the documents." We didn't have folders on Sugihara, but we did have folders on things that I knew Sugihara was involved in. So, for example, Sugihara was an important officer on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So we started with the Trans-Siberian Railroad. What did Sugihara do on the Trans-Siberian Railroad? And we found extraordinary things. we found out about his history and where he came from. We found out that when he joined the government as essentially a spy, he decided to go to Harbin. He didn't want to learn English, which was very fashionable and would have made for him a great career, but he wanted to learn Russian. Why did he want to learn Russian? Well, he sort of had a special passion for Russian people, and he wanted to learn the language because the Russians were very much hated by the Japanese more than any other people, and he wanted to understand why the Japanese didn't appreciate Russians. And he learned Russian so well that he jumped right to the top of the sky of the agencies that dealt with spying, and we got to the documents and we distributed. We knew that he was at certain places at certain times. Nothing to do with saving Jews. Nothing to who could anticipate that anything like that would be needed. But he was there, and these women would start reading the documents to me in English, and I would listen, to how, for example, the Russians loved Lake Baikal, which is very far into what was then called the Soviet Union, and the Japanese really wanted someday to own Lake Baikal. So we understood some of the things he did on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. There were often terrible storms. The responsibility of a good bureaucrat when there's some crisis is to write a report. Whether the bureaucrat, sees anything of it, no one asks him, but he writes a report. So it turned out that every time there were storms and things like that, Sugihra would go right to the train line into Siberia, and he would get to know the engineers and all the people who worked on the railroad, and he would bring food for the poor Chinese people who were dying and freezing, and food and clothing, and his reputation as a kind person began to expand. It didn't start with Jews. He didn't know very much about Jews, but it did turn out that in Harbin there were Jews, and he met some of them, and he remembered them for a long time. His work on the Trans-Siberian Railroad that we were getting read to us by these wives of former diplomats, it just opened up all kinds of vistas. So we understood suddenly his marriage and his involvement with women, and his family life, and all in regard to the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the terrible things that happened in Japanese attacks on Chinese, the rape of Nanjing, where he might have been in regard to all of these things. So there was context to understand. There was, an effort to try to understand his relationship with religion, whether he had any Jewish friends or not. All this came to play when suddenly we discover that this man Sugihra is not in Harbin, but is in Kovno.
But just before Hillel, he married his first wife was Russian.
Yes, she was Russian, and he was very devoted to her, so devoted that about 60 years later, when I discovered her in Australia and interviewed her, he was still sending her Japanese porcelain and all kinds of gifts, and I saw boxes that were postmarked 82. By 1982, he was a complete cripple. He wasn't able to go anyplace. He got this box with beautiful Japanese dresses that his wife would like, that his former life would like. He got them to the post office, and he got them sent to her in Australia. And this was, an ongoing romance that all through his life. Now, one of the things that I was very curious about was what was her background, Claudia. She came from an eminent family, and she was European, and maybe she was Jewish, maybe she was Russian. All kinds of things about his life, could be understood better if we knew Claudia's background. Well, I spent a lot of time checking Claudia's background out, and I also found Claudia in an old age home in Australia. And I thought for a moment, well, Australia, that's pretty far away. I better get some of my free tickets, from. But then I realized, well, this is, stop it, you get to Australia quickly. And I went to Australia, and this woman was in an old age home, and no one knew anything about her background. No one had visited her for 20 years, but she knew the story. She knew a lot about Sugihra. It turns out that she's from one of the most anti-Semitic families imaginable, that had networks all over the world of vicious anti-Semites. She was not anyone who grew up as a lover of Jews, but so, all kinds of details like that came from reading these documents, and these old Japanese women, wives of retired diplomats. It gave me real context to.
But when she met you, knowing the surname Levine,
Yeah.
she was keen to meet with you?
She was willing to meet with me.
And did she show any signs of?
She wanted to talk about her great love. It was the great love of her life. In fact, her husband, most of the years was Jewish. And, he was very nice, but it wasn't as good as Sugihra, who's all the years would send her gifts and be concerned about her safety and where she was during the war, and helped her to get to Australia. So it was a deep romance of a man who had, who knew how to love people, and I think that he transferred to his work in Kovna, and seeing Jews not as the wealthy entrepreneurs that he found in when he went to spy school, but Jews who were desperate, and who would go down the block and go to the American consulate, and and they'd get thrown out. Go to the British consulate, they got laughed at, and Sugihra was the only one who was there, and at the door, and helping people. People would come in, he would say, "Please sit down, here's a cup of tea." Anyone who's ever went to try to get a visa or a passport, that's not the behavior that you experience in consulates and embassies, and he was very, very polite. People offered him money. He shook his head vigorously. We have testimony of this, that he never took bribes, and even the money subsequently, that when he got the visa figured out for people to be able, for Jews in particular, to be able to cross Japan and go someplace else, and because often people who had American visas couldn't use the American visas anymore, because they had to be endorsed in Warsaw, and Jews couldn't go at that time to Warsaw to get their visas. So families with good intentions, spent great deal of sums of money to send to relatives, and the visas were not useful, because we know very well now that the orders in the various U.S. embassies were, precisely that, not to give help to the Jews who were escaping, and so Sugihara was the only door to run to. There were all kinds of other people who came around. We know the story of yeshiva bachers who came to the embassy and said, Mr. Sugihara, isn't your hand tired from stamping these things, and maybe we can make a stamp for you so that it'll be a little easier. We know about some Dutch people, Dutch officials who were barely allowed to roam. We know about Zwartewski. We know
Jan Zwartendijk.
About
Jan Zwartendijk.
Yes, we know. We have material on that, and we also know about the Joint and Beckman, who was there and watching and sending back reports from Kovna and saying, "We got to work quickly. This is a place that we can get Jews to leave and save them," and was unbelievably frustrated by the slow response to his request and his suggestions for how to use this exit route. But it quickly became a route. There were ambiguities in the rules of the Japanese about not helping Jews. Sugihara used all of them, and Sugihara started to issue visas, and the visas that were half visas because of the cooperation of the Dutch diplomats who were around, and it came to be that, by my assessment of the numbers, in view of what the sizes of families were, that there probably were 10,000 people who were able to get visas through Sugihara. Now again, we don't know the small print of these things, so how did they get on their documents from the Russians? Well, one skill that Sugihara developed was unusual for Japanese. He had a real strong capacity for drinking schnapps. In fact, his capacity was so great that he was able to drink any Bolshevik under the table. And he really got along with the Russians because he liked Russians. No one else in the Japanese foreign ministry liked Russians. He liked Russians, and he was able to get work things out if the right sum of money came through, and help people be on their way first to Moscow and then across Siberia, and even to get through the shipping lanes in Vladivostok. It was very, very complicated, and his name helped. People, knew about him from his other mitzvot, from his other good deeds, and they say, well, if Sugihra has signed this, he knows what he's doing, and that was part of the power of his being able to help Jews, because he had such a good reputation, and his government had more important things to do than to monitor these things, though there were some very nasty letters from the British ambassador to Japan, saying that there was, some diplomat who was issuing visas to help Jews get out, and the British government will not be influenced by this. Clear statement that the British government was not going to help Jews escape, with some concern that they might want to go to Israel, and that would certainly be a terrible, terrible thing. And Sugihra just overlooked these things, and his reputation enabled him to accomplish things that no other people were able to do. So that when we imagine what Sugihra was doing, it sounds terribly conspiratorial, but the fact is that much of what he did was within the law, and people like Varhavtik, who came to the embassy, could negotiate with this man in reasonable terms, and some of the Jewish leaders and some of the even heads of yeshivot were really able to accomplish things that they might not have under different circumstances.
The whole Mir Yeshiva was saved.
Well,
the entire Mir Yeshiva, and they were from Chabad.
Yeah.
There were many.
Yeah. So this is a wonderful story, and it deserves additional exploration. Someday we'll find more documents after spending long, hot summers in the American archives, in the Japanese archives. I came back to America and found most of the documents that I had found in Japan were in Washington, in the annexes, and well translated, because the codes for non-military things were broken at an earlier point, and so that material was available to Jewish organizations if they had tried harder to find out what was really going on.
And Hillel, you personally saw the correspondence where the Japanese government said, we don't give you permission to give the visas?
No, I don't think that existed. I think it was in much more ambiguous terms, and I think that he was able to work within the confines of the rules, and whether he was getting threatening letters or not, there was nothing that he was doing that was terribly illegal, and his reputation enabled him to get things going and keep things going. And you can imagine a train that's stalled in the middle of the night in Siberia, and they see this strange visa, from Sugihra. That's the critical moment, and the guards are looking at it and saying, "Oh, Sugihra, I remember him. He was a good guy. Well, look, if he signed this thing, it must be he knows what he's doing. So we can let these people go. All right, everyone back on the train." That's the way things worked out, I think.
And Hillel, in your book, you also mention a bit about Sugihra, and you actually met him personally.
Yes, I think the story was in many ways, and the ways that Sally told the story, was typical for Sugihra, that he got to know people.
He went to the Hanukkah party.
He got to know wealthy people. He liked children, and I find it a completely plausible story, and I don't know why there are some people who have questioned it or deleted it. I knew Saleh. I think he was a good man. He's not a man to make things up. Maybe details were exaggerated, but I believe that story.
And being in Washington now, you have a close connection, or you know Nate Lewin?
Yes, well, the Lewins are great people, and I know the story about the brother who was Dutch, and whether it was the first visa or the 10th visa doesn't make any difference. It cracked a wall, and it made it possible for some Jews, and similarly with the other Dutch officials that were helping out, and we know from Dr. Varhaftig, who actually interviewed the man who was the official in Central America, that whatever was issued in those visas, if they had come there,
it was in Curacao. The governor, he said he wouldn't.
They would have not been honored, and but it was important that they had it because it enabled them to get to Japan. There are also some unsung heroes. There were Sugihras on the other side, in Japan, Jews who had lived there for many years and watched the trains. And when the trains came in, they would take all the yeshiva butlers and they'd take them to bathhouses and find places for them, and sometimes bribe the police, and had those people not been around, it could be that many of the people who had Sugihra visas would not have been rescued.
There was also a Kasuji. He extended the visas because they were only for a few weeks, and it ended up being for a couple of months.
Yeah. And the archives have all kinds of contradictory things that we should save Jewish musicians because we like their music, and one can't just, look here, look there. It was a very complicated situation, and what it was for Sugihra to be a spy and to be going off to Berlin, and who were they giving information to? These are stories that we still don't know the answer, but it's clear that without Sugihra's efforts, his courage, and him being just a Heverman and someone that people respected and remembered, it would have never happened. And it is an illustration of what could have happened if Sugihra could save all these Jews. There were many other places, and now we know that indeed, in places in Europe, in southern France, there were American diplomats who were working, there were Portuguese diplomats who were working. The whole area of diplomats being rescuers has become very important, but we cannot exaggerate it in terms of its total consequence. And the fact is that there still was a Holocaust, and there was strong intention to get rid of all the Jews, and those Jews who were rescued were very, very fortunate, and we should be aware of it and sanctify it and respect Sugihra and remember that we were in terrible situations and other people came to our help, and we as Jews should be doing the same thing, which does happen and is important, and the people who worked for the Joint for years and years and years, were ready to go to all kinds of awful places. People like Ralph Goldman, Zichrono Livracha, were heroes, and through recent years they were saving people in Russia, and we should be proud of that.
Thanks, Hillel. I just want to thank you. It's been such an honor and a privilege, first of all, to have you here in Jerusalem, but I just want to show our listeners
we need more people like you.
Love you, so kind. But this is the book. This is your masterpiece, because it really is, In Search of Sugihra. And if I could just read very briefly. He says, the book does not attempt to explain man's humanity to man. Instead, Levine has woven a fascinating narrative of man's heroic efforts to save lives in the midst of so many seeking to destroy them. And I think this is what your book encapsulates, man's goodness. And what Sugihra did was pure goodness.
Yeah, and it's a mystery still, but we can learn things from it.
So you actually appear in, this was a video, Conspiracy of Kindness, which I also would highly recommend, and you appear many times in this documentary about the story, and it's just unbelievable, and your message is so powerful and so profound. And for our viewers, this is what the visa actually looked like, and this is from the flight and rescue from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and you were on the advisory board.
Actually,
not only advisory board, but you were very instrumental.
I was in the first years. I was the connection with the State Department. I was the person who was who represented the Holocaust Board to the federal government and made sure that everything developed within the right order of things. And those were very heady days of trying to get things going, and I'm grateful to my great teacher, Elie Wiesel, Zichrono Livracha.
You had a very close connection with Elie Wiesel.
The inspiration. I was friends with him for many years before that, but that's why I was in Washington.
Amazing. So Hillel, I want to thank you so much. It's been the greatest honor and privilege. You should just have Mazel Bracha.
I want to thank you for your inspiration.
Hillel,
it's been such a wonderful nudnik. Another wonderful nudnik.
No, but Hillel, thank you so much. It's been such an honor and a privilege.
Thank you. All right.